I'm delighted to be here. This is the first day of the German presidency. I'm very happy to be here, and I will give you a little bit of an overview. I'm not sure I'll be the beef, but I'll try to be the beef as much as possible on what our agenda is for the German G20 presidency. It's certainly an interesting time in the world to do a G20, and we're fully aware of also the importance in a time like that the G20 has. So I'll give a little bit of an overview. I'll make a couple of remarks, and been listening carefully also to the two previous speakers. And then I also want to be in a listening mode. We are very much at the beginning in terms of trying to implement this. Obviously, we've been thinking about this for a long time. Things are changing. We have our first Sherpa meeting on the 12th and 13th of December, so that is next week, where I will have an opportunity to discuss this in more detail with my colleagues. Of course, we've been in touch prior to that, but it's a perfect time for me. And that's the whole point of this, as far as I'm concerned, for me, to listen to you and to see where we should be going. And I'll be sort of brief on, or actually silent on, where we will end up, because I simply don't know. But I will tell you what the agenda is we're going to put on the table, and I also need then your help in terms of all the countries you've been in to push your agenda, of course, and to the extent that aligns with some of the German priorities, it would be very helpful in this world to engage and to also get your support. There's going to be plenty of interaction between the T20 and the G20. We are going to have your thoughts represented at the Sherpa meeting. We'll have a summit which the Chancellor will go to. I'm meeting regularly with the two gentlemen who just spoke, Dennis and Mr. Messner. And so I think it's supposed to be, and we'd like it to be, to the extent that it is possible in this difficult time, to be a very interactive approach. Now, of course, ultimately, it is my job preparing this for the Chancellor to get agreement amongst the G20 countries. And it is not a hard body. It is a discussion at the highest level. I look at it as political messages coming, which obviously are very important, I think now more important than perhaps any other time. Which then help others implementing things. So we don't really implement things to the extent we do in some of the institutions and some of the EU issues or other global bodies which are actually passing laws and thinking about regulation, or even nationally, what we do in Germany. But I think we need to set the agenda, and we need to get commitment by leaders. And I think that is sort of the goal. So that's the spirit in which I'm here today. I want to listen to you, and I'm looking forward to discussing all of these issues with you, getting a feeling of where you think we should be going. The other issue I've been discussing very closely, let me say this also, one thing is what we would like, and clearly we should say that, and you should certainly say that, and I'm sure you will. And the other thing, what is actually feasible to achieve, and that's more sort of my concern. I'm very happy to do a lot of these things, but if I can get consensus, and every country is a veto player in this G20, and I'm happy to hear that we have almost everybody here. Saudi Arabia is, of course, also an important country in the G20, so all of them will have to agree. At least to the declaration. They will not agree necessarily at the summit when they're discussing things, which I find actually not less important output of a G20 summit is the discussion the leaders have amongst themselves, with maybe one person sitting behind them in certain sessions, normally the Sherpa. But that is important. I know also from my leader that when she comes away from, this is true for G7 or G8 or G20, having that exchange is very important, and that is, of course, one part, but then there's the declaration. let me thank again Mr. Messner and also Dennis, who I know for many years, for leading this. The T20 is a very important input, think tanks, and I like, having been an academic myself some time ago now, not as serious as Dennis, but I've been doing some good academic work as well. I like this motto, and I think the T20 is very important. Now, we've actually organized, starting today, a very elaborate, we call it dialogue with the civil society, which I think is one response to the issue is, these guys up there are going to decide about the rest of the world. How can we be more inclusive? I mean, this is still, not the normal, let me say, normal people from the street who's sitting in this hallway here. So these are still people who are engaged, but nevertheless, that's an issue we may have to discuss at some point as well. Even leaders, how do we get our people to agree to things which we think are good? Let me give an example. We've been singing the song of, we've been saying free trade is good. Now, if our people, a lot of them don't think that is true, then we need to address that issue. That's sort of the issue which both of you addressed to on globalization and how can the benefits accrue, and there are many angles to that. And that will certainly be also a topic of the summit. I'll go into more detail in a second. But I think that this inclusive process is very important, and the German presidency wants to not fall behind, maybe expand on what has been done in this before. So in that sense, thank you very much. I know this is a lot of work, and we appreciate that, and I'll try my very best. You have my commitment on that we will take those things very seriously. What you said about what kind of input I would need if I sort of take my position, it's of course not too late, rather early on in the process, recommendations, what is important, what we could be doing. Practical things is something we like. It has to be a deliverable. Now, whether then one can agree on that in the G20 context is another issue, but important, doable things, of course, are more useful for me personally because I need to discuss it with my colleagues. Another thing is we can't solve all problems in G20 this year. Take the big issue of climate change or Agenda 2030, but we'll try to move the agenda. And I think if you look at the G20, and I've been saying this before, I am, in terms of being a Sherpa, the oldest one of all my colleagues, and I've only done it for 6 years now. It also shows you how quick, leaders and Sherpas are changing in some parts of the world. So I've done it relatively long. Actually, the continuity is there. I know there's a discussion about should we be more continuous. The T20 is a process by which we engage in continuity, but the agenda is there. Now, what you can achieve in all of these things, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. And whether we move the world forward, in whatever direction you want to go. Of course, not everybody agrees on where the world should be going. There are periods, for example, on climate change with COP21 and COP22, and also the G7, which Germany did in 2015, and many, many other things. We've had, I think, some progress, maybe not enough, and we need to follow through, we need to implement. But there'll be times where things are moving forward, and there'll be times where it's more difficult. But I think that given that there are so many global issues, and given that I'll go through them for you in a second, and they're not less global issues, they're more global issues. And there is a disconnect. I think the G20 is more useful now, or more important now, if we do it right. And that will also depend on working with you closely, more now than I think any other time before. So I think the answer is not to fall back and say, look, we don't want to engage. Just engaging, I think, is important and is a prerequisite. And I think certainly the Chancellor has also said that at some place or the other already publicly. And we will try our best to get as far as we can. So thank you for that. Then the next point is that we've have a pretty elaborate agenda in the spirit of continuity. If you look at, I think today we'll go live, hopefully with our website. There'll be a presidential agenda on that one. And one issue I think which is important also to keep in mind, and the Chancellor feels certainly strongly on that, is that the G20 agenda has evolved over time. You know, we started in 2008, which was the first time when the G20 was at the leaders level with finance, world economy, which is still going to be very important, as Mr. Messner said, and Dennis, and you know, tax issues where we've made some progress. Also, Mr. Schäuble today is actually, I just came from that. The finance track is also opening up. Yes, last night and today the finance deputies are meeting and discussing the finance agenda. I told them, by the way, I was just there, just saying welcome, a short one. That it'd be good, I think, to think, you know, they'll have technical discussions, but if you look at some of the communiques, I like the communique to be shorter and more leader-like, and I think there should be political messages which the heads of states are discussing. Finance ministers are meeting today, so these are the traditional topics, but we've been moving also into environmental issues, development issues, terrorism, refugees, migration we put on the agenda. Then there are two other issues which the Chancellor feels very strongly about as well, which is health. So health will be a big, I'll go into that a little bit more, will be a big issue. And also gender or women is in all kinds of developing worlds will be a significant issue. And then the other big priority is going to be Africa. We're going to have a big Africa initiative, an Africa event. The World Bank and the IMF are working on that. This, of course, is related to many other issues. So we're moving, so the point here I wanted to make, we're moving sort of from, you know, economics and world financial markets and trade into these other areas. And I think that's also important because these things matter to people. And I think you want to address those issues which are, you know, important for people, and something like health is clearly important. And therefore, I think that's part of the answer of showing that we're useful and that we're delivering on some of these issues. I mentioned already that we want to be inclusive and that we are going to push the agenda as much as possible. Now, in terms of our agenda, let me go then to that part of my introductory remarks. We're going to have a narrative you will see in our agenda, and then we'll break into these three areas where we will treat different policy areas. And the narrative really is one, if you think about world growth, if that's sort of one of the economics of it, then in the past we've been looking at sustainable growth, which we'll still be doing. Past presidencies have pushed the issue of inclusive growth and took this into the policy areas. That's an important issue. We're still going to be looking at how can we make sure that it is inclusive, either nationally as well as internationally. But we thought of adding one other angle to the story, and that is the concept of resilience, the uncertainty, the risk. People are worried about whether there is a sort of uncertainty, downside risk to their economic livelihood. And we take that theme and we say we want to build on that resilience as part of the performance story. So it's not about sustainability, which is it long run fine in a way. It's not about inclusive, which is a redistribute, is it fair? But there's also something about dealing with, you know, feelings of uncertainty. Is the world ready to deal with these global challenges if they occur? And there are, of course, two parts to that. One is prevention, and the other one is once they're there, to deal with them. And we take that theme into the different policy areas. It's very easy. Environmental risks, you can think of many examples where, you know, that is a concern for people. and that really has a hit, is not only an economic issue, but it is certainly also an economic issue. So the G20 is about economic issues, but it goes beyond that. It goes about what concerns people. So taking that theme, you can take it into the financial markets. Do we have a stable financial system? This is sort of something we've been working on for 10 years. We're still working on it. You can take it even into health. Ebola. The next pandemic is going to come. We were very lucky with Ebola. Are we ready for the next one? And you can take conflicts or refugees. There are clear downside risks and concerns and uncertainties. And we'll sort of add that. We're not going to replace the concept of inclusivity or sustainability, but we're saying there's also that part. And we'll add our suggestions on that. And in a way, they're going to run in all these policy areas into two areas. One, we're going to ask, do we have the right institutions, global institutions, which are also being criticized? Are we set up? Let me stick with this example of health, because that's new for G20, or relatively new for G20. And there was some discussion, by the way, whether the G20 should look at health issues. But it was, thanks to the Chinese, thanks very much, also already mentioned in last year's communiqué. And we're going to expand on that. We're going to try to expand on that. And there the question is, do we have the right institutions to have the data to call the next pandemic, to send the white helmets, to have the financing to contain possible outbreaks of the next pandemic? Clearly one institution there is the World Health Organization, which is, by the way, also invited to the summit. That's new for that reason. Health ministers are going to meet. We have a health working group. It's the only additional working group we have is on health. And they're going to ask, in terms of simulations and tabletop exercise is something the health minister are going to do. Is the world ready institutionally to deal with the next thing? There's also the financing aspect. You can think of environmental or other. You get also the financing aspects. We're not going to do, in a significant way, a pledging conference. This is not something which we intend to do. But I think there's one aspect of financing when you're thinking about environmental risks or health or other kinds of risks, and that are insurance models. And we've done that already. We've done this in health. There's a pandemic emergency facility at the World Bank. There are climate insurance risk schemes in Africa, which actually we pushed already back in 2015 in the G20. There are organizations, and they are complementing, private investment of insurance companies with public money. And these insurance schemes are something we may push here and there. As if you have some ideas on that, we'd be happy to pick that up. And of course, the reason insurance schemes are good is that there is this leveraging effect. So you need some public money to get enough support. And the other issue is that I think if somebody is in a bad situation, there's something horrible happening to a region, people are in a very difficult situation. And if you have insurance, you have the right to receive some financial compensation. If you don't, it still works because we have a lot of great international organizations who are helping and donating, but it's a different situation than if you have a right, so we think that is a good one. So that's one narrative which you will read, this idea of uncertainty, global institutions, global public goods, and this little angle on the financing side, which we plan to take more into the insurance world, but if there are other ideas, we can certainly pick that up as well. The other related theme which has come up is this idea of, you mentioned on, anti-globalization, for lack of better word, the population. And the Chancellor has called this openness versus Abschottung in German, which means sort of closing up, nationalization issue. It's a bit related, of course, to this concern that people feel uncertain about their future. There's maybe also some disenchantment with what's happened in the past, undoubtedly. And we need to have that debate. That is, I think, probably right now one of the mega debates which is discussed everywhere. Germany's position is one of, we are an exporting nation. There's the economic angle to it. Of course, we want open markets and we want fair rules. But we still want openness, and we believe multilateralism is more important because the problems are very often at that level, and we need to find, of course, solutions. Now, whether we always do it right is, of course, the interesting debate. One issue is, of course, making sure that the benefits arrive, if the benefits are there. So the first question, are the benefits really there? If they're there, then are they distributed in a way so that large proportion of the population are benefiting from that? That may not be true in some countries. And then the other issue, of course, one is how this is more the democracy question is this information transmitted to the people in a way which is informative and truthful? It's another issue. And of course, but that's also a question of how societies are organized, how information is being distributed. There are, of course, new media out there, and my children who are Twittering and all these kinds of things inform themselves very differently about the current state of the world than I have done. And I still read the newspapers. I don't know whether my kids actually do. I shouldn't say that. But there's that part. And then there's also the part of inclusivity, which is a difficult one. And there's also an issue of subsidiarity. I think that's a big issue, in particular in Europe, since we are in Europe this morning. What should be done sort of at the supranational level and what should be done at the local level. I think all these things, plus, of course, people not feeling sure about what might hit them in the future. I think all of those things are part of this debate. I have no answers to this, but I think, this is what the Chancellor says, openness versus Abschottung. Of course, we also have the refugee discussion in Germany is an important issue. So those are some of the sort of the narrative and the big themes which we're going to be discussing, which I think is very similar to what concerns you. So we'll be looking forward to that. I wanted to now go over a little bit the precise policy areas, and I'm not going to be able to tell you where we hope to end up, even though I have some ideas, but I'll tell you basically what's on the agenda, and then like to listen to also where you think you go. So we take this narrative, which I just try to give you, and it's also in the paper, which will be published today. We take it into 3 columns. The first one is called resilience, which obviously relates to what I said. The second one is sustainability, and the last one is responsibility. And we have under these 3 columns, we have policy areas which we want to push, not push, but put on the agenda and discuss with our nations, with the G20 countries. Let me go through them and mention them, and then if you like to pick up on them in maybe the debate and the panel discussion, we can do it. So the first one is resilience, and there we pretty much have the traditional G20 agenda. So we'll be talking about the world economy, and there it's mostly the macroeconomic coordination issues. We're having a lively debate on that. We have countries following a very different or somewhat different approaches, and that is clearly very important. We usually talk about fiscal policy, monetary policy, and structural reforms, and the language you get from summits on that one is basically we want to do all three. The discussion, of course, is much more edgy than what is in the communiqué, because in the communiqué everybody has to agree. But that's an important issue, and also with some latest developments and some changes in governments. By the way, we will have a French election before the G20, which for Europe is, among other important developments in Europe, is not unimportant. For G20, but also, of course, for Europe as a whole. I think that's our second biggest economy and strong ally of Germany. That's a very important one. So world economy is one issue. Then we have all the financial market regulation issue. You know that very well. You know what's going on there is that, Basel III, they had their meeting Monday, Tuesday in Santiago, which is this Basel committee, which is supposed to make recommendations of how much more regulation is needed. What they're looking at are these internal models of banks to price risks, to look at their risks. And every bank has been sort of using, it's basically the internal models, and the idea is to harmonize them. And when you harmonize them, then there'll be different effects on banks, and some banks are going to have to put more capital, others not. And the Basel Committee has said that they don't want to significantly, on average, raise the capital requirement for the banks, but that doesn't mean that there are effects on that. So this is something which is well known, and let's see whether the Basel Committee is going to make a proposal, and then the finance ministers are going to have to react to that. But that's a big policy. That's a big policy issue, and you can debate it. There are different views, of course, on that. The other issue is that they're going to look at fintechs. So this is an important development also on digital and finance, and obviously the question there is, do we need more or less regulation on these things? You can imagine, looking at all the countries, that there are very different potentially views on that. Let me leave it at that. So I think those the finance ministers, they'll work on some other things, but basically the question is, from a leader's point of view, not being into the details of all these internal mathematical models for banks, which are very technical. Question is, do we have the stability? This is our narrative. Do we have that now, after so many years? Do we have that right, or not have that right? And there are issues of level playing field, because bank models in Europe are different, for example, than bank models in the US. With Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the US, where you can, but at the same time, we want a stable banking system. That's clearly also in the interest of Europe. Then there's taxes. That's also still under the first one. And I'm not going to say very much. This is, of course, an important issue. The finance minister has said many times that this is a priority, and we'll have to see. And I'll be, listen to you if that is also on the agenda. The fourth policy area under the first one is big one, which is trade and investment. This is something we've always talked about at the G20. And of course, we always support multilateralism. And we say trade is, has its benefits. And I think in Hangzhou, in Hangzhou, we said, but the benefits have to be better communicated, and there has to be redistributional, I think it says something like domestic redistributional issues have to be associated with that. We'll have to come back to that, and we'll have to see what the narrative on trade in 2017 will be. And I think I already said enough about that, and I'm sure this is something you have. The other issue, of course, on trade, which is also in the Hangzhou Committee, is the issue of excess capacity. which is an issue we discussed in Hangzhou, and we said we are going to come back to that under the German presidency. This is, of course, an important issue for many countries, and we'll have to work closely together with all countries to get a solution to this issue. The final area is employment. That's, of course, ultimately huge. We have a ministerial meeting of the labor ministers. Of course, they will talk about issues, and this is even a trade issue of, the supply chain, responsible business conduct. You want these multinational trade, but you don't want them to destroy, the environment and the social benefits. I'm not saying they do, but clearly this is an issue which Germany also pushed very hard in 2015 when we were heading the G7, working very closely also looking at the OECD, with the OECD on that one. And the other big issue, I think, on employment, there are many issues which they may come up with, is what Dennis was saying, is this change because of digitalization. There are huge debates on that, artificial intelligence and replacing, I think you said when it's predictable, replacing people, and that's a big policy area, which is on the agenda of the labor ministers. Moving on to the second pillar, which we call sustainability issues. And there we're going to have energy and climate. That's the first one. We like to look at them together more. There will still be groups which look at climate and energy, but then they'll also meet together. And they're referring to what Mr. Messner said. It's about implementation, follow-up. We have some ideas, but we'll have to discuss all of that. Let me leave it at that. We're doing a study on I guess that's known on the OECD, on a decarbonization strategy. How can that be achieved such that economic growth is spurred? Because if you do this right, then we believe, German government certainly believes that that's growth enhancing, that will create jobs, innovation, technology. And that message, by the way, should be good no matter where you stand on climate change. If it's good for the economy, you should do it if you want the economy to grow. So that's an issue. Then we have Agenda 2030, which is about implementing, and we'll be pushing hard on that. Then we have also digitalization as a separate topic, even though I should put a star on that, because digitalization, I think, plays a role in anything, virtually what I said, or almost anything. But we'll still have a digitalization focus, and we have a ministerial meeting also of the digital ministers. And, and they'll be following up on infrastructure issues, standards, and norms. I think that is an area where G20 is useful. Following up on much, by the way, I should have said this all the time, we're following up on many of these things on what the Chinese presidency has so successfully done. So we're very grateful, and we're working together, by the way, in the Troika with the Chinese presidency very closely, and with the Argentinian, who is the next one, and we're working closely on that. The other issue in that second pillar is health. I mentioned already pandemics, and we'll be looking at that. Have we learned our lessons? What is left to be done? Maybe nothing. Maybe we still need to do things. The other issue are antimicrobial resistances. This is a big issue which we've been discussing. Difficult issue, but we feel like it's an important one. So we'll want to keep putting health on a G20 agenda. it's economics, it's more than economics, it's close to people's lives, and we feel like this is important. The final issue in the second pillar is gender, or empowering women. And here we've had some previous commitments. We want to follow up on those, see where we are. There are a couple of other ideas we have here which we need to check. Moving to the third pillar, which is called responsibility, and there we have the migration and refugee issue, where we've had language in the previous communique, and we like to follow up on that. And of course, that's an issue which concerns Europe a lot. And clearly here, again, we can ask the question, do we have the right institutions? Are they strong enough to deal with conflict in parts of the world? There's also the issue of integrating migrants and refugees into the labor market. We're doing a lot of that in Germany. We feel like a discussion on that might be useful. And then there's this Africa emphasis, which also fits in that one. This is also something which finance ministers, together with development ministers, are dealing with the help of the World Bank and IMF. We're working on some ideas there. Couple of other points there. One is combating terrorism finance. There is FATF, which is an organization which is fighting that, including money laundering, which we want to look at. There's the issue of corruption, huge issue, cross-cutting issue, which we will develop further. There is an action plan for 17 and 18 already passed on corruption, but there are a couple of angles which we'd like to strengthen. If you have any suggestions there, I'd be very happy to take that into our discussions. And the final point I want to make on the last one is agriculture. We also have a meeting of the agricultural ministers. I think this may be one of the first ones in the G20. And they'll actually meet in January in the margins of the Grüne Woche, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the largest food fair in the world, here in Berlin, and many of them are already there, so they'll have a meeting in the margins of that. And there are two issues there which are, I think, particularly interesting, and they'll be discussing. One of them is the issue of water. There is both availability and sustainability of water. As you know, in many areas, and not in some areas in the world, this is a source of conflict potentially, and I think agricultural ministers will discuss that. So if you have any input on that, either to us or to the agricultural ministries, is much appreciated. And the second issue, which we find an issue which may come up to the leaders, is the role of, there we are again, of information technology in terms of raising productivity in agricultural markets. There's apparently a lot of development there. I think one example may be observations from space and data to raise the productivity of agriculture. And there are all kinds of issues in agriculture, small farmers and development issues, which are very tricky and very potentially, you have to be careful one does the right thing if one wants to help. But this issue of ICT in agriculture is another one of those issues which they will push. Okay, let me sort of leave it at that. I've sort of given you maybe a taste of what is on the agenda. All of that is subject to discussions, and we'll have to see how far we can get this year. Germany is very determined to push these agendas and to move it forward. And it's not going to be very easy, but we'll try very hard. And again, we're open and try to be inclusive, and therefore very happy to be here and listening to your comments. Thank you so much.